Welcome to the In-Depth Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Harris. In-Depth is a bi-weekly program where we will speak to people from all different walks of life to find out where they came from, what makes them tick, and where they're headed in the future. This week, we go in depth with Dr. Bill Patzert. He's a recently retired NASA oceanographer and researcher who has spent the last 40 years spreading the gospel of environmentalism and warning those who will listen about the dangers of climate change. Dr. Bill Patzert, thank you for coming to the In-Depth Podcast. How are you this evening?
I'm great. Really nice to be here with you, Aaron.
Glad to have you here. So you just retired, 2.5, 3 weeks ago? Just not too long ago?
Yeah, January 18th. It's been about 2 months right now.
2 months, I'm sorry.
But, I really haven't retired. I've been so busy. But, no, I did. I bit the bullet, man. I took the money and ran.
How long were you in the science game? How many years were you doing?
Well, I started my graduate work in 1965 in Hawaii, and then I moved from there to the University of California on the beach there at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography.
I've been there.
Yeah, 1972 to 83, and then since 1983, I've been at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So, and let's put it all together there. That's almost 50 years of geeking out,
Right. Yeah, that's a long time, but you've been to some really nice places to geek out. So, I guess it was a really great trip for you all those years. So where did it start out for you? How did you get interested in the science?
Well, like my mother always used to say, if I didn't keep busy, I was always in trouble. And I had interesting parents. My mom was heavily involved in civil rights and ardent feminist in the 50s. My dad was a sea captain.
A sea captain?
A sea captain, and he had gone to sea for many, many years. And he was a man that he loved books, and he loved nature, and he loved the ocean. And so he saturated me with all the great books, both scientific as well as great literature, and so he spoiled me forever,
Right. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, is that one of the books you read?
Classic. Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Joseph Conrad, Herman Melville, all the great classics.
They call me Ishmael.
Yeah, right. I read Moby Dick when I was in the 5th grade. Of course, I thought it was a great adventure story, and I was all set to go and search out the great white whale. But later in college, I minored in American literature, and I found out it was a great morality story.
Right. You understood there was a cost to the hunt of the great white whale.
Yeah, but, in the 5th grade, man, sign me up. Where's the Pequod?
Right, you boat with the harpoon and go out there and handle some business. Huh? That's great. So your mom was an activist in New York in the 1950s.
That's correct.
That is... I can't see that. But I mean, when I think of women in the 1950s, I think of Marion Cunningham and, at home taking care of the family and getting dinner ready for her husband when he's there and, and the kids and the whole 9 yards. But obviously she wasn't that.
No, she was a social worker. She had a master's degree in social work from Columbia. And so she did pioneering work in social work. Actually, later in life, they moved to Los Angeles, and she did interesting things like interracial and even gay adoption, some of the first ones that were done here in Southern California. And so she was a courageous, bold woman.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
So your dad was a sea captain. Was he what kind of vessel was he on? Was he a merchant?
Yeah, during World War II, he captained merchant vessels supplying the troops in Russia and Europe. And then after the war, he had a little fishing boat. He ran out of Long Island. And as a kid, he had two Portuguese guys that couldn't speak English working on the boat. And they would take me out to the Grand Banks and learn how to fish. Of course, he went broke fishing, but, weighed an awful lot of fish back there in the early days.
Right. Hey, it's healthy, right? Now, did his stories of adventure on the high seas and everything that he'd done, his exploits as a merchant marine during World War II, did that push you to go towards oceanography?
Yeah, he didn't have the opportunity to get a higher education, but he loved to write and he loved to read, and he saturated me with books at a very early age. I remember I was reading books in kindergarten. Mm-hmm. So, some of the first grade books on in the 50s, Rachel Carson's The Sea Around Us,
yes,
The Silent Spring. Mm-hmm. And so at an early age, I was indoctrinated into both the environmental issues as well as I was definitely destined to be a buddy. Later we moved into the Midwest, lived on the shore of Lake Michigan.
Okay.
Great Pleistocene sand dunes, and Lake Michigan's like a mini ocean.
Right.
And so even then, he keep me out of trouble. They kept me into the Boy Scouts. Huh. And the Boy Scouts were great for me in the 50s. Mm-hmm. Really inner city kid. We didn't have much money. And so all the things that I learned in the Boy Scouts really set the stage for my later scientific career.
Okay. Well, don't act like you were just an average Boy Scout, Doctor. You were an Eagle Scout, and Eagle Scouts usually achieve higher things. So you were obviously a bright child.
Well, maybe hyperactive. That was it. But for inner city kids, the Boy Scouts really provided an awful lot of opportunities.
Right.
And I grew up in Gary, Indiana.
Oh, with the Jackson 5.
The Jackson 5, right. That was a little later than me.
Right.
But Gary was a very diverse city.
Okay.
A lot of different ethnic groups. At that time, it was 55% black. So it was the largest black city in America at that time. And so it was a pretty exciting, interesting, wild and woolly place to grow up in.
You were exposed to a lot of different culture and different people, not only just people that look like you. You got to see and experience a lot of different things then.
I think, everybody's grandparents spoke with some kind of an accent. Parents, Right. So one thing I can tell you, the food in the neighborhood was great.
Yeah. Well, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Oh, man. So, I understand that whole thing about the Boy Scouts because I was a Cub Scout for a few years, and I was an inner city kid, and the Cub Scouts definitely got me. It was my first camping trip and learning how to build the race cars and, doing stuff that I never would have done just sitting at home. So I can understand your how exciting your experiences were.
Yeah, I know. In many ways, the Scouts provided more than the public schools did. We went to some pretty bad public schools back in the day,
Right.
And so the Scouting really a lot of things that the schools didn't provide.
Right. Exactly. So you grew up in Gary, Indiana, and after Gary, you went to college. You graduated from high school in Gary, Indiana?
That's right.
Okay, and so you started your career in academia. Where did you begin at?
Well, my freshman year in college, I went to a small school in the northern peninsula in Michigan, and they gave me a scholarship. That was up in the upper little place called Houghton, Michigan Technical University.
Okay.
And inches of snow that winter, all right?
Right.
And that was enough for me, all right? When I went back my second year, I blew my knee out playing basketball. Uh-huh. And I actually didn't go back my sophomore year. I took a year off.
Okay.
And did some traveling. I hitchhiked to New York, and I got myself a job on a tramp freighter out of Lake Charles, Louisiana.
Oh, wow.
And so I spent that winter traveling to Egypt and Pakistan. I spent 2.5 months in Indonesia.
Oh, my gosh.
And so that was a great year. I really learned a lot. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, my next year I went back to school. Finally graduated from Purdue University.
Okay.
With a degree in math and physics. But I also had a minor in geology and American literature.
Okay.
So, which is a funny mix. But
right.
I love to read. I love books, and I'm still that way. I'm definitely a book addict. But I remember one cold winter evening in West Lafayette, Indiana. The pipes had burst in our apartment, and I went to the library. My feet were freezing. I was soaking wet. And I saw this coffee book in the new book section at the library on surfing in Hawaii. So there it was, white sand beaches, young women in bikinis,
Right.
Big surf. I was always a waterman. Wow. And so at this point, I went next to the catalog and ended up at the University of Hawaii, where I spent 7 years in Hawaii.
Okay.
Surfing all over the islands and diving all over the South Pacific.
And going to school in between.
And going to school. But in spite of all my bad intentions, I had some great mentors. Okay. And what they did was really set me up for my next job, which is oceanographer at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography.
Right.
That was fantastic, and of course I chose it because at that time I was a hardcore surfer. And so I had an office right on the beach.
Oh, yeah.
And I could keep my board right in my office. So that was sweet. So I'd go, straight from the lunchtime waves to teach my afternoon classes. Right? Yeah,
but your students love that.
No. It's a great place, and they do great work there. And it was the early days of large-scale climate variability. Studying things like El Nino and La Nina.
Right.
And global warming were the early days of global warming research.
When nobody had heard about it.
Yeah, actually in the 1970s. I remember the first Earth Day was in 1970.
Is that right?
Yeah. And nobody was talking about global warming back then. No. Actually, of global cooling, the Earth was starting to cool off a little bit. Nobody fully understood what was going on, but it was all about the first Earth Day was all about clean air and clean water, environmental issues.
Right.
And of course, there was a lot about sex, drugs, and rock and roll too. The first, it was a blowout. But the field matured at that point. There was a growing awareness of these larger global issues on the environment. And after 11 years at Scripps, I got hooked up with some really smart NASA. We're putting together satellite programs.
Right.
All right. It was the advent technology. The first weather satellites were being launched. We were using them for wave forecasting. Did some of the casts.
Now, how does that work? What are you looking for in a wave forecast?
Well, waves are the great travelers, and they're generated by these giant storms that you see in the North of the South Pacific. And the first satellite images that showed in detail these great storms,
right?
You could tell how large they were, how strong they were, and how long they lasted. And on the basis of that, you could, using models, mathematical models, forecast when these giant waves would arrive on, for instance, the beaches of California or Hawaii. So it was an exciting time. And it was all essentially due to this new satellite technology.
Right, because usually people that study oceans, they're doing it from the ground. They're not. You were in a groundbreaking time using satellites instead of being here on Earth and trying to, estimate.
Well, that's exactly right, Aaron. And it was a period. Before that, it was Iron Men on wooden ships. Most of the oceans are pretty remote and inhospitable. So for the first time, we were getting these global views of the world's oceans, which, of course, cover 70% of the planet.
Right.
So I had a job offer. University of California wasn't paying much back then. And so JPL essentially tripled my salary.
Oh, well.
And I threw my lot in.